Welcome to the second episode of In My View. The first one in the last week had dealt with the RBI report on demonetization, and this one would talk about the Supreme Court's judgment on decriminalizing Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. The Supreme Court of India delivered a judgment related to the decriminalization of deviant sexual behaviors in India last week. A judgment which was highly applauded, well received across the country and in many other countries outside India, and was almost seen as historic in its own way. It's historic in its own way for a very simple reason, because the struggle to reach this judgment has been a long and arduous one. And yet, all that this judgment does is it just decriminalizes Section 377. It neither overrules it nor does it strike it down. For the court believes that this is something that has to be done by the Parliament of India, and rightly enough, this is something that belongs to the purview of the Parliament of India. Section 377 has had a long life in India, starting off from the Penal Code of 1861 when it was first legislated. And since then, it has been criminalizing all behaviors, all sexual behaviors, which, as the section says, are against the order of nature. You have millions of people across the country who have been targeted as part of the pursuit of the application of Section 377. Millions who have been incarcerated, who have faced humiliation, some who have also perished and have been forced to commit suicides, and so on and so forth. As the court rightly says, it is essentially a section that runs against the morality that underpins the Constitution of India, which guarantees to the people of India certain inalienable rights, certain rights which just cannot be taken away, and certain rights which just cannot be impounded for any reason whatsoever. Before Section 377 was enunciated as part of the Indian Penal Code in 1861, there is nothing on the Indian landscape before 1861 which can talk about penalizing deviant sexual behaviors. Neither do you come across it in ancient India, nor do you come across it in medieval India. Neither do you have anything in terms of law, custom, or tradition which would say that deviant sexual behaviors need to be penalized. So the first time deviant sexual behaviors stand penalized on the Indian landscape is in 1861 as part of the Indian Penal Code. This is done by Lord Macaulay, and this is one legacy of Lord Macaulay, which a number of people have clung on to, though there are so many other aspects of Lord Macaulay's actions in India which they find despicable and wrong. Section 377 became a part of the Indian Penal Code on account of the fact that, as far as English law is concerned, we already have since 1533 something that is called as a Buggery Act. The Buggery Act was instituted by the government of King Henry VIII, and the Buggery Act almost seems to be a way by which the king is trying to get even with the forces of the Catholic Church, who are now threatening him with excommunication on account of his desire to divorce his wife, to divorce his duly married wife. So one of the most important things that the Buggery Act in England does is it just doesn't punish people with deviant sexual behaviors. It goes about impounding their assets. It goes about taking over their wealth. It goes about using everything that they have to further the cause of the sovereign. So it seems that more than detecting and disciplining deviant behaviors, what the king had in mind is punishing the Catholic Church. And that's exactly the way in which the Buggery Act was applied. That's exactly the way in which the Buggery Act was used. After this, after the 16th century, as England goes about conquering territories all across the world and turning them into its colonies, what one gets to see is in most cases across the world, which are British colonies, some form or the other, the Buggery Act is imported wholesale and becomes a part of the legal architecture as far as these countries and territories are concerned. Stays on as part of their penalizing structures even after these countries become free in the 20th century from British thrall and dominion. So it's very interesting that be it in Malaysia, which is ostensibly Muslim, be it in Sri Lanka, which has a huge number of people who are Buddhist, be it in India among people who are Hindus, be it in Pakistan, which has Muslims, be it in Zimbabwe, which has Catholic Christians, in Uganda, you have Protestant Christians, in Jamaica, you have the Rastafarians. So, people of diverse religious beliefs, people of diverse ethnic backgrounds, do hold on to an idea that deviant sex is unnatural, is wrong, and deviant sex is something that needs to be punished. Now, very interestingly, all these countries and peoples at some point of time or the other were governed by the British. So, what you have is this British idea of rule of law bringing about a sizable behavior, a sizable change in social behaviors to an extent that people start believing in something which says that certain sort of sexual behaviors are completely unnatural. To wit and to sort of look at Justice Chandrachud's judgment as part of the five judges who have delivered on this, well, it seems nature is inherently freakish, hybrid, fluid, uncertain, fallible, and hence, seen from the perspective of sexual purist, immoral. So it's not us that are wrong. It possibly is nature that is wrong. Nature incorporates everything in it. The division between something that is natural and non-natural is human. It doesn't pertain to nature. So one needs to have and take this off its way that there is something inherently natural. Something that is inherently natural is also something that is understood to be natural by the human body, by the human self, and something that is mediated through a human agency. B, for a long period of time, you have ample examples, as Chandrachud's judgment would keep on quoting, wherein, except for living species that procreate asexually, practically every other living species does show you examples of behavior which are bisexual, which are transsexual, which are intersexual. So, in almost all these cases, there is no way by which one can talk about a straight, pure, singular sort of sexuality. So this is something that one needs to be very clear about, that what section 377 in 1861 was trying to prohibit, was trying to penalize, is something that is completely unknown to the affairs of both nature as well as man. So the striking down of this section does restore a certain sense of dignity, a certain sense of selfhood to people to whom this has been denied for quite a long period of time in India. In India, the application of Section 377 becomes all the more appalling for a very simple reason, because we are just not talking about people who have deviant sexualities. Most of the time, people who exhibit them, people who live by them, are also people who are coming from the lowest sections of society, namely people coming from the lower caste, people coming from the lower classes, people who have been more or less forced to meet a desire, to meet a demand for a certain sort of desire, and people who have been trained in it. This has been a part of our traditional landscape for a very simple reason, because if one looks around, there are multiple shrines across India that celebrate transsexuality, that commemorate it and almost divinize it. The Kovagam festival in Tamil Nadu, the Bauchara Mata Mandir in Gujarat, all and sundry such shrines all across the place. Communities of Hijras, of Aravnis, of Jogappas, of Londas, all across the country are testimony to the fact that what Lord Macaulay was punishing was not something that was getting created in India, but something that was already present on the Indian landscape. And something that was a part of Indian tradition, something that was a part of who we are as Indians, is what Lord Macaulay was sort of punishing, was what Lord Macaulay was deeming to be wrong. So one believes that yes, it was time that something had to be done about this, and something had to be done to restore a certain sense of self to the people who were involved in all of this. Yet, not quibbling about anything of this, one believes that there isn't much to celebrate as far as the court decriminalizing it is concerned, because the court hasn't followed it up by restoring elaborate sense of equality as far as these communities are concerned. So you start off with the Nas Foundation case in 2001, which was ruled in favor of the Nas Foundation in 2009 by the Delhi High Court. The judgment was overturned by the Supreme Court of India in 2013, and then now in 2018, the Supreme Court of India sets everything apart and says that, well, it's time to decriminalize it. But the court is not taking this to its next level in terms of we don't have any clarity in law in terms of homosexual marriages, which are already a part of the Indian landscape. You have a number of Indians who have already contracted these types of marriages with partners who are both Indian as well as non-Indian. There's no clarity in law as to how does a court or the law need to take a look at these types of unions. There is nothing in this judgment in terms of people with deviant sexualities procreating, raising families, disposing of assets. And until and unless the law doesn't speak one way or the other about this, one just doesn't understand as to how would this law, how would this decriminalizing stand in actuality. One small problem with what the court has done and with the sort of media orchestrated, media led, and media hyped celebration of it is the court ruled de jure something that was already de facto. It seems that the court has almost been late in arriving to this point, something by a decade or more. Once you had social media coming up, once you had 4G smartphone technologies coming up, once you had a whole host of apps which enable people to connect with each other coming up, once you had dating apps coming up, once you had Airbnb apps coming up which provide people with spaces to indulge in what is essentially private, it seems that people, both heterosexual as well as homosexual, are already indulging in a whole range of behaviors, not bothered about does the law consider this to be tenable or untenable. So it seems that what we have as of now is the court is taking a de jure position about something, which de facto it is in no longer a position to either prohibit, stop, or avoid. So that's one small thing that one has got to take a look at. Then you have this whole problem that yes, on one hand, you have a legislature which doesn't want to overrule it by law, something which ideally they should do. And it almost seems that if the celebrations about the court decriminalizing it are even a tad right in terms of public opinion in India, then on this count, Parliament possibly doesn't represent the opinions of the people of India. B, the government in 2015 took a position in the Supreme Court which said that if the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, decides to decriminalize Section 377, the government of India would not challenge it. So essentially, there seems to be some sort of social acceptance of it. B, there seems to be things afoot wherein people are already indulging in it. C, a government which has more or less said that it would be indifferent to whatever the Supreme Court does. It seems that the court ruling in favor of decriminalizing almost becomes inevitable. The court, if the court had done something else, it might have had sounded very, very different. So it's in the light of all of this that one needs to understand and look at the entire purport of this judgment. B, one also needs to understand this, that living in contemporary India in 2018, where so many of us all across the union are in a situation wherein we are insecure about whatever we are doing, believing, hoping, breathing, eating, dressing, socializing, reading, listening, and where it seems that the law belongs to gangs of armed men, for lack of any better word, and the state is indifferent to these gangs of young armed men taking the law into their own hands, almost ripping apart the promise of Chapter 3 of the Indian Constitution. How would the court decriminalizing Section 377 exactly help people who are involved in all of this, who are practicing deviant sexualities? There is some sort of a problem in terms of numbers. So, on one hand, in 2012, the government of India has gone to the court to inform the Supreme Court that, according to whatever information it has at its disposal, there are 2.5 million people in India who are in possession of deviant sexual behaviors, who are behaving in a deviant manner. 7% of whom are confirmed HIV positive cases. Activists, researchers, academics, and people belonging to such orientations more or less believe that the numbers are far too high. So, according to them, the number possibly stands close to 100 million and more. The confusion is on account of the fact that there isn't much widespread understanding of what constitutes deviant behaviors. What constitutes this whole idea of bisexuality, intersexuality, transsexuality. So one feels that if the court's promise in its judgment of this judgment, so the court has promised the people of India that the government of India would shoulder the responsibility of widely publicizing this judgment so that people who are involved in this will not be penalized by society at large, and they can be in full control of both their lives as well as their selves. But one just doesn't understand as to how would this work. There is a social perception in terms of fear, hatred, a certain sense of degradation, a certain sense of humiliation, a certain sense of pollution as far as people who are transsexual and intersexual is concerned. Now, in the light of this, how is the government of India going to go ahead and inform the people of India about the purport of the judgment that has been delivered by the Supreme Court of India? So, on one hand, one just doesn't know as to how should this happen or how would this go ahead and happen. How would this happen in a world wherein people feel insecure about the presence of somebody who is transsexual or intersexual? How would they react to a situation wherein you are possibly being told in as scientific a way as is possible that, well, your idea of your sexuality is wrong and possibly even you possess a fluid sexuality? So how would we react to all of this is something that is open to all manner of questions. And in the light of all of this, it seems that there is quite a lot of work that actually needs to be done. The court has almost taken upon itself the responsibility of protecting people from stigma, from humiliation, from degradation, from all manner of insults, people who are practicing deviant sexualities. But on the other hand, there's this massive problem that we have been facing for the last 4 years and more, wherein people in India can't eat what they want to eat, can't dress the way they want to dress, can't socialize with whosoever they deem it appropriate to go ahead and socialize, can't speak, can't read, can't make films, can't sing, can't articulate anything. So on one hand, you have millions of Indians who are all manner of linguistic, religious minorities, who are people from the Dalit and the Adivasi communities, who are women, who are men, who is practically everyone that comes to mind. The Gauri Lankeshas of the world, the Rohit Vemulas of the world, the Dr. Dabolkars of the world, the Pansares of the world, in whose case the promise that the Republic and the Constitution made to them, their individualities, their selfhoods, on account of Chapter 3, stands ripped apart on almost a daily basis. So, in that sort of situation, how does the court look upon itself, and what all is it that the court would be doing to see to it that this new section of people in India, whose existences and whose to be whoever they are, the court respects and wants all of us to respect, if it stands violated, if it stands degraded, if it stands ripped apart, what exactly is it that the court would do in terms of restoring the same to them? Bleak for a simple reason, because if it hasn't done much about the others who have lost their lives, who have lost their limbs, who have lost their sources of livelihood, it seems little that would come the way of these people by whatever the court can do. So it seems that there's some sort of an intricate relationship in terms of if the court wants us to be assured of what it has done by decriminalizing Section 377, the court also has to work post haste in terms of assuring millions of others in whose case Chapter 3 stands ripped apart, that well, the court is the best guarantor of the constitutional promise that was made to us in 1949. Until and unless that doesn't happen, well, it seems that there's not much promise from this judgment as such. Though it might sound to be a good judgment. B, one just doesn't understand as to what exactly is it that these five judges were looking at, as is evident from these 500 pages that they have filed up. So you get a lot of quotations, a lot of sayings, songs, everything that has been said by people who are not Indians, by academics, activists, researchers, scholars, philosophers, jurists from across the world, ideas, opinions being thrown as far as these 500 pages of judgment are concerned. And yet, if one looks at India itself, both in English, in the vernaculars, in Hindi, you have an enormous amount of information, enormous amount of work being done in terms of projecting what people who are transsexuals, intersexuals, homosexuals in India have been thinking about, have been living through. Not much of it gets reflected in the judgment. So it most of the time seems that if you want to come up with an authoritative judgment, you better quote people who are not Indian rather than quote people who are Indian. And one just doesn't understand as to what should one do with that sort of a dichotomy. If we are talking about a judgment which needs to hold true in India, why are we shying away from talking about, from articulating, from expressing, quoting ideas, opinions, testimonies, lived experiences of people who have been living and doing it in India? So just small quibbles, but small issues which one feels do matter a lot. There has been an unnecessary sort of diversionary tactic which has been played all along the way. So when the defense in the case of this judgment starts talking about um, the necessity to retain Section 377 by insisting that doing away with it would peril India's security, by by talking fantastical and unimaginable sort of about unimaginable sort of situations, by saying that if you let these types of behaviors hold on, nothing stops soldiers on the Indian frontiers from indulging in it, and that would peril, that would bring India's security in danger. And wow, look who are these people who are talking about it. People who a couple of days, a couple of months, a couple of weeks ago would have had been ready to knock down anyone who would even cast the slightest aspersions on the integrity, on the fidelity of the Indian armed forces. Are people who go to court to talk about the fact that, well, if Section 377 is done away with, soldiers away from their families and from their wives would indulge in behaviors which would peril India's security. Beautiful. So it almost seems that there's no argument. If one is making an argument as stupid and as frivolous as that, there practically is no more argument which is left. It had to go for a very simple reason, because it was something that was a part of a colonial legacy, which is untenable under the promises which have been made to the people of India by the Constitution of India in 1949. It had to go for a simple reason, because the British themselves have given up on it. So it's like almost a different sort of a situation, a different sort of a world in which we now are, where British foreign policy actively tries to foster a certain sense of equality as far as transsexuals, intersexuals, homosexual communities, bisexual communities are concerned, and takes umbrage, takes objection to the functioning of any government with which it is supposed to deal, who is penalizing, who is trying to police, discipline, and treating these sexualities in what the British see as a wrong way. Well, in most countries across the world that were governed by the British, these sections became a part of their penal systems precisely because they were governed by the British. The British gave up on this in 1967, and since then they have been almost in evangelical sort of a way trying to see to it that countries should drop it off and should not make it a big thing, should water it down, should in some way or the other do away with it. And if countries insist on dealing with Britain through the prism of such types of sections in their penal law, Britain finds this to be pretty difficult and objectionable. So that's the way by which the world changes, and the world is a changing place. So one has got to recognize and acknowledge that if there is something which was a part of the landscape, it need not be the part of the landscape for all times to come. And one need not quote nature in a wrong, unscientific, illogical, irrational sort of a way to substantiate one's deep held insecurities about people around us. So one feels that what the court has done is right. There is absolutely no reason to believe that it has done something that is terrible or wrong. It's just that one doesn't seem to see purpose in celebrating it for a very simple reason, because we have already moved miles away from it. We just don't know, and we feel insecure about this, that if in the case of so many of us, chapter 3 rights stand suspended and an indifferent government just doesn't help us, and the court delays judgments about such events and incidences, how well should anyone take the guarantee that the court gives us as far as decriminalizing this is concerned? So those are just some insecurities that one feels about all of this. There's nothing more that one has got to talk about. It's a judgment whose time had definitely come. Thank you.
Press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss another update from the Unique Academy. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned.